Greetings. This is History as a Weapon, and I'm your host, Dr. Sundiata Kaita Chajua. Today's guest is Earl Ofari Hutchinson. Dr. Ofari has a BS degree in psychology from California State College, Los Angeles, an MA degree in humanities from California State College, Dominguez Hills, and a PhD in sociology from Pacific Western University. He is the author of multiple books on race and politics in America. He is a political analyst. His books include a trilogy on the Obama years. I'm going to read them in order of most recent publication. The Obama Legacy, How Obama Governed the Year of Crisis and Challenge, and How Obama Won. His most recent books are The Trump Challenge to Black America, From King to Obama, Witness to a Turbulent History, and Bring Back the Poll Tax, the GOP's War on Voting Rights. He is perhaps most known for The Mugging of Black America, and particularly for The Myth of Black Capitalism, which has been reissued with a new introduction by its original publisher, Monthly Review Press. Dr. Hutchinson is going to be a tad late, so I just want to do some kind of comments. As a teenager, I was greatly influenced by Dr. Hutchinson's The Myth of Black Capitalism. It, along with I guess I would say the classic of that era, Black Awakening in Capitalist America. And I think it would be fair to say that there's been very few books written by African Americans that their major focus is a critique of capitalism and its impact on Black folk, right? We can go all the way back to, of course, Slavery and Capitalism by Dr. Williams. But then we kind of jump to the Negro as capitalists in the publishing in the 1940s. And then when we get to the high tide of the Black Liberation Movement, we get in 69, Allen's Black Awakening. In 1970, Dr. Ofari's The Myth of Black Capitalism. So when he does arrive, it's going to be a pleasure to talk to him as someone that whose work had a particular and very influence on the way I came to see the world. So why don't we just take some questions in terms of the relationship of African Americans to capitalism and think about why there have been so few work by African Americans that have focused on a critique of capitalism. So I pose that as a question that we can engage in the chat while we wait for Dr. Afari's arrival. Okay, I see a question by Shane W. asking, how do you feel about Robert Allen's Black Awakening in Capitalist America? Shane, that book probably had a greater influence on me than any other book I read, including the autobiography of Malcolm X. One of the things that I thought that Allen did that actually no one had done prior, and I, I don't think anyone has done since, and that is that Allen began with the colonial argument. And I don't want to say colonial metaphor or analogy because I think it's very, very clear that African Americans are colonized in the US. But what Allen did was he looked at how, given the movement into positions of power, albeit at the lower rungs of the political system, uh, that Black folks were beginning to take control politically of the cities in which they held a plurality or a majority of the population: Cleveland, Detroit, Gary, and a number of other places, right? And what Allen began to argue is that the colonial system that had functioned uh, largely in the 20th century was being remade, and that was being remade in the kind of uh, along the lines that Kwame Nkrumah had argued in neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, right? And so what Allen saw in terms of looking at Black mayors, Black elected officials in cities, and the incorporation of Black folk into the corporate sector, he saw them as neo-colonial managers. And he began to talk about the ways in which this new Black elite, his argument was that the old Black elite had been destroyed and this new Black elite was emerging, and that it was causing a transition from a more traditional form of colonial relationship between Black people in the United States into this newer form of neocolonialism. And I thought that that was a tremendously powerful argument at the time. And it certainly played a great role in influencing me. Um, so yeah, I, I was truly fascinated and encouraged and stimulated by that analysis. RSVP. Okay, no, let me move up. Okay, that looks like the only question that we have. Okay, so how about questions about what's happening internationally um, in terms of Palestine? Any comment about the the success of South Africa in arguing that there was indeed genocide occurring in the Israeli Defense Forces invasion of Gaza? Okay. Let me text this brother because I was under the impression that we were talking about a few minutes. Okay. Sherry Jones, I can't tell you where Jackie is, unfortunately. So why don't I say a few words about, um, I was beginning to talk about the small number of books. Okay, from Leah Boggs, we have how does that correspond to the breakdown of Black communities where Black doctors and teachers lived in the same community as maintenance workers? And one by James. Hey, Doc, do you feel wealthy Blacks are oppressed? Let's start with the latter. Um, oppression is a big concept, and if we're thinking in terms of discriminatory practices and policies, if we're looking at it from the standpoint of access, then certainly wealthy Blacks have and do experience forms of racial discrimination as they seek to acquire contracts, um, loans, etc. So yeah, they do suffer from racial oppression. There, that's clear, right? Um, because the system operates on a variety of levels, and one level is that it is vehemently anti-black, and to that extent, every person of African descent in the society suffers limitations based on racial oppression, but but they don't experience economic exploitation. They don't experience police harassment as a routine aspect of their life in the same way that people who live in predominantly Black communities, people who are working class, uh, do. But it would be a real mistake, on the question of reparations. There are some people who argue that wealthy Blacks are not due reparations. I think that such a position is to deny the racial oppression that they experience throughout their lives, and whether or not, for a variety of reasons, um, they were able to mitigate its impact, doesn't deny that they still experience levels of race based oppression, and probably earlier in their lives, a much wider span of oppressive situations, unless they came out of a wealthy background. Uh, Now, Leah, how does this question of capitalism correspond to the breakdown? We have Brother Afari. Dr. Afari, can you hear me? Your picture is very unclear. Okay, I'm gonna remove you and bring you back. Dr. Ofari. Okay, this appears to be really not working. I can't get him. Here we go. Once again. Hmm. All right, Dr. Ofari, can you speak? Hmm. All right. So I'll just go back to trying to answer Leia's question, which is about, let me get to the first question, not the cast question. The question about how Robert Allen's argument about neocolonialism corresponds to the breakdown of Black communities. I think uh, it's a little more complicated than that, in that when we think about the ways in which Black communities are broken down, I think what we have to do is look at the ways in which, through government intervention, right? One way to think about this in a very tight way is that in the 1950s, as suburbanization is developing, and the federal legislation requires that suburbs be homogenous. So white people were moving to the suburbs, and these would be homogenous suburbs. Black people could not get those kinds of loans and were stuck in the communities that they had basically migrated into as part of the Great Migration. Now, the exit of white people from the cities to the suburbs created a crisis for downtown capitalists, right? Those retail shops. They no longer had that customer flow, and we began to see also in this era, the 1950s, the development of malls, and those regional shopping malls were always placed outside of the cities, or in a anyway, so they're placed outside of the cities, and so that creates a crisis for downtown merchants. And they use urban renewal as one way to respond to that economic crisis for these downtown merchants. And that response is, of course, to clear out the Black community through urban renewal, because Black communities were generally abutting at a central business district. So you clear out Black property. And so the big point here is that capital moves from developed areas to underdeveloped areas. And so the Black community largely underdeveloped. And so when we talk about the first initial breakup of Black urban northern communities, and to a lesser extent Southern, but ultimately Southern, of course, it's due to urban renewal, and it's for the purposes of creating better opportunities for downtown business, right? The second move is, as the interstate highway uh, system expands, right? That's what aided suburbanization, made it possible. Let me see if we're going ahead. Okay, Dr. Ofari,
Hello?
can you talk? Good, good. Okay.
I've been
Okay.
trying for the last 15 minutes. This is only the second time I've ever used StreamYard.
Ah,
So I'm not a tech person.
ah.
Um, so I'm sorry about that. I actually have to dial you up on my cell phone.
Oh man. Look, I understand. Let's, Leia, I'm going to stop with that explanation, and we're going to get into our discussion with Dr. Ofari. So I've already done the introduction. I've highlighted the books, but I'm really want to focus some of this discussion on the Obama books, and on a small book of yours that I always really liked, The Mugging of Black America, right? But also, of course, one of the reasons we're here is to talk about the re-release of the myth of Black capitalism. But let's start from the position of, brother, tell us who you are. I know you're born in Chicago in 1945. You're part of that cohort that would eventually give us Black power, right? But what I'm interested in, I'm a devotee of Bill Cross's negrescence theory, right? Black identity formation, or the Negro to Black conversion. And so I always want to start by asking my guests biographical questions. So tell us how growing up in Chicago, and tell us what side, you South Side, West Side, what side, growing up during the era in which the civil rights movement was beginning to pick up pace, and we're headed toward I guess we call it the rising tide of the Black liberation movement, and your class background. How did those three things, the time in which you came into your formative years, the place, and your class background influence your decision to become a Black scholar activist?
Well, you're right. I was born in Chicago in October 1945. Now, my mother and her side of the family, they are originally from Iowa. They were Midwesterners. My father, these are Southern people on my father's side, Tennessee, and they relocated back in that time to St. Louis. And then he left St. Louis in the 1940s and relocated to Chicago, the post office. You know, at that period of time, for decades, the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, if you worked at the post office and you were Black, you were what was called a big shot.
Yeah.
You were an important person in the community because, doors were closed to many other areas, as we well know, during that period. But the post office, that was the principal place for African Americans at work. South side of Chicago, the Jackson Park post office, we lived on the south side. Now, here's the interesting thing about growing up on the south side in Chicago. Now, from about 1948, 49, when the Supreme Court knocked out restrictive covenants.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that
1948, Shelley versus Kramer.
Damn near every place had a restrictive covenant on it. And really what that meant is whites would not sell to Blacks. The south side of Chicago in that period, and I have to tell people this today because they don't have a concept. You might as well have been living in Mississippi. It was absolutely locked down, segregated. Now, what my father did, he was a pioneer in many, many ways. He was a quiet civil rights activist. What he did in 1950, 49, 50, somewhere in there, he actually bought a place on Greenwood, which was if you can imagine this, in the Hyde Park area. This was lily white then. No African Americans. We're talking about 49, 50, somewhere in there.
Now, was this a blockbusting move on the part of the realtor? Because
here's what's interesting. Another part of our little hidden history that many people, well, certainly young people, would never know. To actually break a neighborhood then, to get an African American into a home in a white neighborhood, the whites would not sell to Blacks. So what they did was they got what they called a nominee. Almost always, Sundiata, the nominee was Jewish, because there was sympathy there on the part of many Jews. So
they also were under restricted covenants in some places.
So, and that was the way around it. So what he did, he got a nominee. The nominee was Jewish. The nominee bought the home, and then what he did, he quit claimed it Black back to my father. But that's what they did. A lot of Blacks did that, not just in Chicago, but other places too.
Okay.
Now, for the first year, my father lived at 63. We lived at 6357 Greenwood. For the first year and a half, he could not live in his own house.
What?
What happened was my mother, for all practical appearances, appeared to be a white woman. She literally could pass for white. Now, she wasn't trying, but everybody
Right.
She had red hair, very fair skin. She and her mother actually lived in the house by themselves. And my father would have to come over at night after dark finally somebody,
Oh,
but wait a minute, it got even better. Somebody finally spotted him one night, and they said, "Oh, we got an NIG in the neighborhood." So what happened was, for about 6, 7 months, my father had a gun, kept that. He laughed about it later on. Kept a gun there, and there were 2 police officers that were assigned to stay in the vestibule to protect the family. They actually did that.
wow.
When my father said that there were demonstrations in front of the house, get the NIGs out of there, get them out of here. He said when they finally figured out they couldn't do it, you'd have to see this to believe it. He said within the space of 1 week, every house on the block had a for sale sign,
Wow.
and they were gone. They were gone.
Brother, I have, a city and suite story in Detroit is precisely what you just described, but the rapidity with which they left. Wow. So,
They were gone. Woo, woo. And the other thing is, as you know, the realtors moved in and made a killing off of that.
yeah,
They loved it.
yeah. They got the white people to sell low, and black people bought high.
And bought high. Hey, I mean, they made literally the bandits that they were. All right, so I grew up on the South Side. We lived a couple of places in the High Park area. Later on, we moved south as blacks started moving further and further south into the Chatham Fields area, or Chatham Park.
Okay.
We lived there for a few years, and my mother and my aunt, they came to California one summer. They fell in love with it. Now, there was another migration, not only of blacks from the south to the north, another counter migration later on of blacks from the northeast, like Chicago, Detroit, to the west, especially Los Angeles and the Bay Area. So in the early 60s, my father retired from the post office. We moved to Los Angeles. One other thing about Chicago before I leave that. I went to Mount Carmel High School my freshman and sophomore year. There were only about 20 blacks at Mount Carmel High School then. We were one of the first classes in Mount Carmel, and we caught hell. The blacks caught hell at Mount Carmel. You'd be walking down. I'll tell the story. People just die. I'd be walking down the hall because everything was in one building then. Walking down the hall, lockers there. You go into your locker. Next thing you know, you look around. Boom. You're being shoved into the locker, elbow, and you look around, nobody knows anything.
You
just had to deal with it. So then we moved to LA, and then
now, how old were you when you came to LA? Were you a teenager?
I was 15 and a half.
15 and a half, okay.
So I started my sophomore year. No more Catholic school. We're in public schools now because the schools were much better then in LA.
Right.
Not now, but back then they were.
Yeah. And they still might be better than Chicago schools.
So, well, in fact, actually, what black parents did back then, because the public schools were so lousy in Chicago even then, if you had a little money, you put your kid in a Catholic school.
That's right.
That's what they did it then.
They still do that.
But we didn't have to do that. I went to public schools in LA, played football, track, graduated from Dorsey High School, then went to Cal State LA. Now we're in the 1966, 67. You know what's coming now? The Black Power. That hit. At Cal State LA, I was the president. We had the first black student union. No, the second, I'm sorry. The second black student union on the West Coast. The first was at San Francisco State with Huey Newton and the Black Panthers. That they were born there. We had the second at Cal State LA. And I was the president, first president of the BSU. The vice president was Ayuko Babu. You probably heard of the Pan-African Film Festival.
Yes. It's still going on in LA, right?
It's going on right now.
Yeah.
So Babu, he was the vice president, and we had a lot of other notables that came out of the Black Student Union then. So it was very, very interesting period. We demanded the Black Studies program. We demanded a lot of things on campus. We backed them down. We had a lot of top speakers that came to the campus. We brought everybody from Muhammad Ali, when he was the frock for that period. We brought him out.
Right.
Many of the Panthers came out. Karinga, US organization. Stokely came out. Kwame Ture. Bobby Seale, we had them all out. So that was the formative period. And 1970, actually 1968, I started writing a small column for the Los Angeles Free Press. We had an alternative newspaper. That was the era of the alternative newspapers.
Right.
The LA Free Press was a big newspaper then in LA and actually nationally. I wrote a little column and discovered one thing. I could actually write. I discovered.
So what was the name of your column?
You know what? I don't even remember, to be honest with you. You know, I don't even think it had a name. It was just, you know, writings on particular topics involving the burgeoning Black movement. Well, that evolved into 1969, Richard Nixon, Black Capitalism. I was intrigued by that. So I wrote a series of few little articles on that, started doing some research on it, looking at the history of Black economic development. The rest is history. Out of that came and evolved the Myth of Black Capitalism, Monthly Review Press. That was my first book. And actually, over the years.
So you were still a graduate student then?
Actually, let's see. Yeah, that was my first year in grad school. And actually, grad school was just continuation at Cal State LA. Later on, I went to graduate school at Cornell. I was part of the first class when they had in 1970.
Wait a minute, were y'all, you were part of that?
Well, that opened the Africana Studies Center.
Yeah, okay.
Unfortunately, and I had great professors there. Dr. John Henry Clark was one of my mentors, and he got me my contract for my second book on Henry Highland Garnett with Beacon Press. Dr. James Turner, he passed away, about a year or so ago.
Right. Yeah.
He was one of the founders, movers and shakers for decades.
Yes, he was.
Built that up. We had just about anybody that came through there, scholars, academicians, lecturers.
Well, y'all had Bill Cross. Bill Cross actually taught there too.
It was a great period. Oh, so I stayed there for a year, came back to LA, and then was involved with a number of different organizations. Went on, got my graduate degree from Cal State LA, and then continued writing. I got a job at that point in time with the LA Free Press. I worked for them for about 2 years, covered a lot of historic things in the early 70s. Just about anybody who was anybody came through LA. And I actually was the only reporter. So I had to take pictures, do the interview. So, for example, Cesar Chavez, Muhammad Ali, Dr. Ralph Abernethy, I can go on and on. I interviewed them all. Huey Newton. Had interviews with all of them, and I put that all together in a book. But Sundiata, let me tell you the interview that really always above every interview, and this is very important. In fact, you're the first in your audience. You're the first to hear this. What I'm going to tell you.
Okay.
After I left, I got an offer to go to KPFK, Pacifica Radio,
right.
News and Public Affairs. Now, follow me on the date now. This is late 1973. So I started doing a couple of shows there. One a jazz show, had a sports show, but I was mainly doing interviews of notable folk that would come to the station. So I got a call one day from a record producer, and they said, "Hey, we got a guy coming to LA, and we'd like to bring him over to KPFK. Would you be interested in interviewing him?" Now, when he told me who he was, I didn't know who he was talking about. But I'm gonna tip it a little bit. They said first time he's been in the United States. He's coming from Jamaica, and he's in LA to do some recording at a recording studio. All the recording was done in LA.
Yeah.
So they brought this guy to the station, and I had no idea who they were talking about. Never heard of him. When he came to the station, this very short, very light skinned. This is the first time I had ever seen dreadlocks.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like a foreign something to me. He came up to the studio, very, very mild. I think I got to ask one question. The interview was 35 minutes. Within that 35 minutes, I got to ask one question. For the next 30 minutes, Bob Marley went on nonstop talking about Rastafarianism, which I didn't know anything about, talking about Haile Selassie, religion. He never once talked about music. All he talked about was Rastafarianism, religion, God, deities, the movement, what he was into. And here's the thing. We recorded it. When he left the studio, I'm scratching my head. What the heck was that?
Right.
Over the years, people have said, wait a minute, you interviewed Bob Marley? It was like sitting at the lap of Jesus Christ. You went to the mountain. You interviewed him.
Man, and the Marley picture is going to open up soon. Right?
So I'm going to do an op-ed column talking about, my experiences that day with Bob Marley. But you know what? Final thing on that. When people would ask me today about that, I had to rewrite history. Oh yeah, I knew who he was. I was a great fan of his. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh
yeah. It was just breaking the reggae explosion. Absolutely. Man, that's a fantastic story, brother. Are you well, you did write a memoir, right?
I did.
You did.
And in the memoir, actually, I talked about my experiences, not only that, but my travels to the Soviet Union back then, Cuba, China, when they were still communists.
Yeah.
I went on delegations. They used to have delegations of writers and artists. And I went on several delegations, major trips, the Sixth Pan-African Congress at Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Back then, when they still had the guerrilla movements in Southern Africa, ZANU, ZAPU, the Freedom, all of them were there. And I did interviews with all of them. So I compiled all of that in my memoirs, something along the lines of people that I knew and I have known, and up close and in person.
Brother, repeat the title so that some of our audience can rush out and get that. In fact, I'm going to read it. So what's the title of the memoir?
Go to, I'll just tell people now, I've written 35 books. So after a while, I'll start losing count. Go to Amazon. And, before,
I got you.
Before we're through, what I'm going to do, I'll have somebody pull a copy and pull it up.
Okay. I got you, brother. I hear you. So tell me about the Hutchinson Report. Why did you start it? When, and what's the impact that you think that it's having?
Well, the Hutchinson Report actually evolved out of a newsletter. After I left the Free Press, and then later on in the 70s, I left actually the 80s, left KPFK in Pacifica. I started, I still had the urge, to write. I have a family now, married, I had 2 children. So actually I had to get a day job. So what many people don't know, for the next 25 years while I did my creative stuff, I actually worked for the state of California. I'm an engineer, as a safety engineer for the state of California. Almost no one knows that or knew that at the time. Wow. So I handled Cal OSHA programs, safety programs for the State Compensation Insurance Fund, workers' comp. So, that was my job during the day. And at night, I did all the creative stuff.
Okay.
The Hutchinson Report came out of that. It was a newsletter. And then at KPFK, they had a change of management in the mid-90s. I had been out of radio for about 8-9 years. But they had a new manager, a new program director. They reached out to me and they said, were you interested in coming back and doing a show? So I came back about the time of the OJ trial in the mid-1990s. And of course, I did a lot of media stuff, a lot of TV stuff, commentaries and all of that around OJ. But I was doing the radio show and we called it the Hutchinson Report. Now, I had that show for about 8 years. I left KPFK for about 4 years, went back again. Actually, 3 times I left and came back. So now I've been doing the current Hutchinson. Actually, it's not the Hutchinson Report anymore. It's now the Earl Ofari Hutchinson Show. Well, it's the most popular show in the Pacifica Radio Archive. It's an hour show. We rebroadcast it. And, news, public affairs, primarily topical issues of the day, and always with one eye on politics, politics, politics. I
Yeah.
mean, that's what I do. And we like to do a little activism. And by the way, one other thing in tandem with that, I also formed a nonprofit activist organization,
Right.
the Los Angeles Urban Policy Roundtable. And we've been on the point on a lot of issues, the activist issues, not only in LA, but beyond.
So tell us something about the roundtable and what you're doing.
Well, for first, back to about 2005, 2006, when actually I started the roundtable and a couple of other people. We used to have weekly forums.
Okay.
In Los Angeles. There's Leimert Park, which is well known.
Yeah.
So we used to have forums there every Saturday, and I tied it in with my radio show. Sometimes we actually recorded my show there with a live audience, and we would pick whatever the topic was, pertinent topics. Did a lot of interviews. We had a lot of public policy maker, business leaders, elected officials, you name it, they came through. We had them. I'd interview them. Sometimes they would make presentations. Then we'd have discussions. So that went on for about 5-6 years. I got tired. We're getting up there.
Yeah.
So I got the radio show back, and I said, you know what? Now we'll just do everything, on air. People come up and ask me all the time, hey, Earl, now we need those round tables. We need it back. What I've done is a compromise. Every Sunday, there's a restaurant in IHOP here, not too far away. They have a little room there. We have what we call a round table breakfast every Sunday, and we bring a lot of people together. So we have breakfast, and it's very informal, very relaxed. Sometimes if there's a topical issue, we might even do a press conference when we have the press there. So, it's been a combination of things, primarily the writing, primarily radio, some TV, and a lot of when the opportunity is there and the need is there, we jump in with both feet.
Good.
The stressing moments, I have to say this. When you talk about media, and especially Black radio and Black producers, we know about Roland Martin, people like that. We lost it last week. A man that I had a 40-year relationship with. Wow. We go back. Joe Madison.
Oh yeah. Wait, I didn't know. I knew he was on his deathbed, but I didn't realize Joe had died.
I didn't either. I got the text this past Friday, and I was shocked. Joe and I, we go back 40 years.
Wow.
Joe, every time I would go to D.C. on one of my book tours, Joe back then was on WOL, Kathy Hughes' station. Joe always said, hey, Earl, come on down. We did the interviews. Some of the interviews actually I did with Joe, I put up on my Facebook page. Joe, I always say this. The individuals I put on the highest pantheon in terms of not only love and respect, but those that are endearing to me, those that have never, when I really need it, and I know I don't ask a lot, rarely, but when I do, when I do make that request, they don't say no. Yeah. Joe never said no to me. And he always furthered my career. Joe had, by the way, a very popular book club, too. All of my books, by the way, were listed on his book club. And every time Joe put one of my books up there, boom, it went up the charts. I mean, the guy was that popular.
Yeah. No.
We're losing a lot of my generation, as you well know.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So that's why it's important, you did the memoir, but we need more people of that generation to leave that memoir, that autobiography, so that we don't have to rely on what this generation of scholars will say about you. Right? We'd rather get it from you. So let me shift a bit. Your life is fascinating. So in the book that you did 50 years later, Why the Murder of Dr. King Still Hurts, I want to pose two questions to you that come out of that book. One, early on you talk about how capitalists have perverted holidays, and that's what they do. They turn, what is sacred into what is profane so that they can make a profit. But you make the point that they have not been able to turn King's holiday into just a materialist effort for them to engorge themselves. So it's not a cash cow for the corporation. So why? They've been successful with every other holiday. Why has the King holiday not become economically profitable for U.S. corporations? Brother Earl, you're frozen. Try removing yourself and coming back in. Let me see here. I'm going to remove you and then I'm going to bring you back. Okay. He'll come back when he's able to get it together. So let me say this. Uh, Start thinking of some questions that you want to have Dr. Ofari Hutchinson respond to when we're able to get him back in. So, so we were previously talking about the ways in which in three movements, capital, okay, maybe he's capital reshaped African American urban communities. Okay. So I had kind of commented on the way in which urban renewal was used to acquire land that African American communities was on, and particularly urban renewal played the role of breaking up the historic Black business district. Right? The second move in breaking up Black communities was, of course, the war on drugs. And Dr. Ofari Hutchinson's book, The Assassination of the Black Male Image, speaks to that in some ways. And of course, the third move is gentrification. And clearly, these are moves that are done by capital with government as their handmaiden, so to speak. And of course, we know the long legacy of various forms of economic exploitation, right? The demand for Black labor, and we understand the shift from the moment in which, you know, from our arrival, and when they began to keep statistics on the labor force, Black people, particularly Black women, were more involved in the labor force than were white folks until we get into uh, the mid to late 70s, at which point uh, white women entered the labor force and gained parity. And by parity, I mean in terms of percent of involvement in the labor force. But of course, they're working uh, more middle class jobs, right? Than are Black women. And of course, white men ultimately catch up with Black men in terms of engagement in the labor force. And in fact, one of the most interesting things that you'll find is that um, I think it's late 70s, early 80s, you'll see that Black men's participation in the labor force drops by 15%, and white women's participation in the labor force increases by 15%. I mean, it really is a substitution, right? So we know that economic aspect in terms of the exploitation and expropriation of Black folks' labor. Uh, so if we think about African American history, in the last few years, we've had two books come out that focus very clearly on the Black working class. Joe William Trotter's, I think it's something Arrival, right? And then there's a wonderful new book by Blair Kelly, which for whatever reasons, I can't think of the title right now. But, you know, historically, there's been an emphasis on the petty bourgeoisie in African American history, historical production. So we're beginning to see an important turn here. Okay. I think this is a question for Dr. Ofari when he's able to get back on. What do you think about its formal academic development as a discipline or sub-discipline? And that's the second part of I'm not seeing the first part of that question. Yeah. Okay, I'm not finding the first part of that question. But let me go back and, you know, again, hopefully Dr. Ofari Hutchinson will be able to get back on. Okay, thanks. Black Folk is Blair Kelly's book. Brother, you back. Good.
What happened?
I don't know.
Hey, you know, it's technology. Anything can happen. You were asking me about Dr. King and the book?
Yeah, I was asking you, you know, the book 50 years later, why the murder of Dr. King. So I wanted to pose two questions. The first is why it hasn't become the King holiday. Every holiday in the U.S., Capitol has perverted. Why has Dr. King's holiday not become a cash cow for them?
Very simple. The same reason why we have a Donald Trump. you got half of America, maybe even more than that. You got half of America that anything and anybody that looks like you and I, and anything that has to do with us, I think you know where I'm going with that one.
I do.
All of a sudden, it's like the Pavlovian dog, knee jerk. They'll figure out a million ways around it. And I did write a series. By the way, while we were out, I was able to check up on the book. It's From King to Obama, Eyewitness to History. From King to Obama, Eyewitness to History. You can get it on Amazon, by the way.
I actually included that in my introduction of you, which you didn't hear.
Well, we got ahead of the game. But anyway, back to King. King is, for many, many years after the King holiday, first of all, had to fight like hell, as you know, to get the holiday. But then after, very grudgingly and reluctantly got it. I used to write columns every year around the King holiday, pointing out one thing. It's the least celebrated holiday in America. And it's always seen as, quote unquote, a Black holiday. And I also had to point out, if you notice one thing, all the stuff around King's holiday, the King holiday, is always 90% Black, a parade somewhere, a street somewhere, a school, almost always in the poorest Black neighborhood.
Poorest Black community. Absolutely.
So it's not seen, you know, it's not an American holiday. It's not a universally celebrated. And very simple, because we're not. We're still marginalized, top to bottom. We're still an outlier people, top to bottom. And from any standpoint, health, education, welfare, public policy, and especially economics, it doesn't make any difference. And we know, of course, one of my other landmark books, the assassination of the black male image.
Yes.
We already know all the myths and stereotypes. And, I mean, you can go on 10 years on that one. So all of these things taken together, we come back to Dr. King. Basically, he's seen as a black historic figure, not an American historic figure.
I guess what I want to counter with, because they do like to co-opt folk, right? And the not the far right, but the old style Republicans, they were very good at trying to claim Dr. King and focusing on and taking the comment about the content of our character out of its, both the context that it appears in the speech, but out of the context of his life, right? So I was, just, you'd think that they would try and co-opt a little bit more, but you said they simply reject on the King holiday. So let me move to the second question, which is the basis of the book. You asked the question, what if Dr. King had lived? So had Dr. King lived, what do you think would have been his impact? Would he have been able to prevent some things, soften some things, weaken the thrust toward fascism that we now have? How would it have mattered?
It wouldn't have. Dr. King would have been totally marginalized. You have to remember one thing, when you go back to that period, 1968, he was already becoming marginalized. Even then, he was no longer invited to the White House. All the big gun civil rights leaders at that point, all of them had rejected him because of, Dr. King's stance on the Vietnam War. Right. They had all rejected him. He was not invited anywhere. He was an outcast. There were even polls then that a lot of African Americans were not big on King. We're not just talking about white Americans. We're talking, and others, we're talking about Black Americans. So King was increasingly moving to the margins with the Poor People's March. Now he's talking about not only the Vietnam War, and of course the horror of that, and pointing the finger at the U.S. government. He's also talking about class issues now, not race so much, class disparities. Even now, the guy is being pilloried. Now you're a Marxist. All of these things. Right. The FBI and Hoover, they had an insane vendetta to nail Dr. King. So I think his place pretty much by 1965, after the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah, he moved that.
Role in that. I think that was actually the pinnacle for Dr. King. After that, if he had lived, he would have been quoted here and there. But the times have moved by him. He would have been seen as now kind of a historic icon, probably got a professorship somewhere, did a little lecturing, wrote, books, but increasingly away from the margins because everything was changing by the early 70s. We're seeing now more and more African Americans moving into some parts of society that they were totally before.
Absolutely.
And now you also saw something else, which I've spent a lot of time analyzing and have written about, starting with the myth of black capitalism. Now something that's always been kind of hidden because race has been so dominant. Namely, class has always been an element to one degree or another because we live in a class society in America, even though they try to deny it. It's still a class society. Rich and poor, all points in between. So why would you think that wouldn't certainly affect African Americans? Even in that neighborhood I lived in, totally segregated on the south side of Chicago back in the day, we always had the Black doctors, the Black business people, the Black clergy hierarchy. They lived on the same block, but they lived differently than we did.
They
lived totally differently.
But sometimes they lived on the hill. On the same block.
And even if there wasn't a hill, they made a hill. So there was literally a separation of church and state. So that was the thing Dr. King certainly put his finger on. And frankly, in my opinion, that was his strongest point. But also at the same time, I just simply think Dr. King would have been more and more a forgotten figure.
Yeah, I've heard people say the same about Malcolm X, because certainly the high tide of the movement was beginning to wind down in the 70s. So I want to shift, and you did 3 books on Obama.
Mm-hmm.
So can you sum up the impact that Obama had on the U.S. empire, but specifically on African-American people? And would you say that there's something that his administration did that improved the lives of Black folk? And if so,
Well,
what?
you're right. Actually, I did 3 books on Obama.
Yeah, you did 3 books.
Yeah, I did a follow-up after the other one, The Year of Crisis and Challenge, the second book on Obama. But anyway, it's kind of a mixed bag with Obama. Obviously, we know the first African-American, obviously we president, obviously we know history being made, obviously we know that Obama had many, many challenges because at the end of the day, he's still Black.
Oh, yeah.
And he knew that.
And they told him coming in that we're not going to let you pass anything.
No.
Yeah.
In fact, actually, one of the truest statements that Donald Trump ever made, he couldn't have gotten it. He nailed it when he made the statement. He said, "Thank you, Obama. You elected me." In other words, Trump nailed it. Now, he's using Trumpian hyperbole, which is what it wouldn't be Trump if he didn't. But the fact is, there's an element of truth to it, too. The backlash against Obama never went away during those 8 years of his administrations. So it made possible to Trump. I think Obama was what I would call a good centrist, corporate, liberal Democrat. Said all the right things as a centrist, but he's not going to take that he could not take that next step. The next step is into progressive politics, really zeroing in and even talking race. To the extent he could get away with it, he did from time to time, tipped around it. But I mean, frontally, for example, during the whole 8 years of the Obama administration, just one area to illustrate, Obama never could do what many in the Congressional Black Caucus urged him to do, and that is African-American young males between the ages of 16 and 24 are absolutely the most despised, outcast class in probably the world on the planet, the most stereotyped, and certainly the most vulnerable and the most targeted. So there was always a thing, Barack, you've got to go after special programs, special initiatives, special this, targeting. Obama's thing was, no, I can't do that. Because, I'm just going to focus on trying to, raise the economy, blah, blah, blah. And that will help everybody. Well, no, it doesn't.
Yeah. Now, he believed in universalism. And as we know, a rising tide don't rise all boats. Never
rising tide is what it's doing is sinking us even further. I'll give him the credit. Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. I mean, certainly, obviously, that was a major effort. Where he could, he did some things within the criminal justice system reforms. Some of his judicial appointments, very good. So I'm saying there were things that he did as a good centrist Democrat. But on the fundamental class economic issues that slam poor Blacks in Black America, there's not much of a legacy there that we can build on.
Right. And he spit a lot of poison on our image. He talked really bad about that class of Black men that
he did.
you were talking about. So this is a perfect segue into a piece that you did recently that I think I got off the Hutchinson Report website. It's entitled "Black Community Confronting the Chaos: My Personal Encounters with LA Street Takeovers." Did you coin that phrase, street takeovers?
I'd like to take credit for it, but no, I didn't.
Okay.
That's been
Yeah.
around for a while.
You know, I think every Black community is dealing with this, right? Even here in Champaign-Urbana, we're dealing with that phenomena, and people get shot often at those street takeovers here. In fact, here in Champaign, by proportion, we have an equivalent number of shootings and killings of Black folk as Chicago, once you look at it from the standpoint of proportion. And you could say that about the whole corridor in central Illinois, right? So this is a national thing, these street takeovers. So what I'm interested in is that when I read your piece, it read different than the assassination of the Black male. It seemed there you pointed to structural solutions. In this piece, you pointed to solutions of policing.
Hmm.
And so I kind of want you to square the circle.
Okay. Well, actually, it's both. When I actually did two things. One, a little something else I've been playing with, and I'm really enjoying it. Facebook live stream. I'll go out and I'll do an op-ed piece, but what I'll also do, because I write a column for the African American paper here, The Wave, but I'll take it out to the street, right on location, do my own filming, and I built that up. We got thousands of viewers. But anyway, back to that. I tried to do both. Just did another column on that because a reporter asked me, "Why do you think this is happening? And where are we going with it?" One,
But that's what I want to ask you. Why is it happening?
well, several reasons. One, partly subculture. You got young people. They're all young people. I would hope they're young people.
They're young people. They're in their 20s. You might have a couple of 30-year-olds, but they're young folk.
They're young. And the thing that struck me, it looks like a little United Nations out there. You got some of everybody: Hispanics, Asians, whites, blacks. You got them all out there. And thrills, a happening, part of something I can get away with for a hot minute, excitement, poverty, that's in there too, a laxity on the part of, I don't want to get into a moral breakdown and all of that. I'm not going there with that.
Okay.
But
so I thought you were hinting in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, the right wing likes to say that, we got a moral breakdown in society, blah, blah, blah. If anything, you need to look at yourself in your so-called morality. Your morality.
They don't want that.
You're broken down. Not
broke down. Yeah.
But you know what? Fundamentally, here's what I think drives this. It's a structural problem in this sense.
Mm-hmm.
When young people, I've always said this, young people are basically a reflection of the adult world, for better or for worse. Now, when young people look around, they see corporations gouging the public. When they see public officials lying and cheating and getting away with it, when they see a certain former president doing whatever he wants to do, flouting the law, thumbing his nose at it, getting away with it, don't you think they pay attention to that? It's not a moral breakdown, it's a structural breakdown. Yeah. So young people say, oh, okay, we got a lawless society at the top in the adult world. Why would we be any different? So I think that's what you're seeing now. You're seeing basically a structural lawlessness that has now gravitated down to young people. By the way, we have a little bit of another spinoff. It's not just street takeover. We have another phenomenon too that's happening too: mass robberies. Not snatching. Yeah. I'm not talking about that.
Oh, wait a minute. You're not talking about the gangs that go in and snatch and grab? You're talking about something else?
This is something different. Where now you have young people like the street takeovers. They'll target almost always a small Black and or Hispanic owned business. And, through social media, they'll say, we're going to be here at a certain time. They'll go in and they'll ransack the store. We've had several of those. So now you got a new phenomenon. It's structural lawlessness. That's the root of it.
Wow. Okay, that one hasn't made its way here yet. But I assume, once something starts off in one part of the country, it inevitably spreads, particularly with social media. Wow. Okay. So
it's powerful.
So thank you for that. Now, the new introduction to the myth of Black Capitalism. And I was saying to people before you came on how influential that work was in my life, right? As a teenager when I read it. And I was making the point that there's really only been a small number of books by African Americans that have critiqued capital directly, right? You get some stuff around the margins, but that was one of the books. I would say, obviously, Allen's Black Awakening, Marable's Capitalism, the underdevelopment of how capital underdeveloped Black America, etc. My colleague Jared Ball's the myth and propaganda of Black buying power. But it's fortuitous that your book that has been re-released at this moment is sorely needed. But in the new introduction, I want to quote you. Okay. A half century after that publication of the Myth of Black Capitalism, the state of Black business remains exactly as I wrote in 1970, small and marginalized. That's kind of damning, don't you think? So,
well, I stand by that statement with a little qualifier. As we well know, nothing stays the same.
right.
That's the nature of society. It's change. But things do only change to a certain extent. Sometimes they reform, just like, cellular things. They can come in many different forms, but it still retains its same basic character. When you look at African American, a classic case to prove that, during COVID, we had the 2-year siege of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Who got the majority of the business loans? COVID loans? Who got the majority of the business grants? You got the richest of the rich.
Yeah.
They did survey after survey, study after study, finding two things. One, small African American owned businesses were left out in the cold, by and large. The second thing they found is still proportionally the number of African American owned small to medium sized businesses were still very tiny. Now, this is not Earl Ofari Hutchinson talking.
Right.
We're talking about studies that were done during that period. So they just reconfirm what we knew. I think the bigger question is why? Why is that? And we come back to the class issue again. You can't get away from it.
Mm-hmm.
It drives everything. Even now, the fact is, if you're a small business person across the board, and especially African American business person, you're going to need a loan, a grant, money, funding, something. You're going to need a customer base. You're going to need promotions. You're going to need a certain support level in terms of how to do your taxes, how to meet all the requirements of business. These are things that really work against small African American, almost still mom and pop. The owner of the business, if it's a restaurant, the guy or her, she's in there doing the cooking, sometimes the serving.
And so the kids are working for free.
There you go. So we, in a capitalist society, it's always weighted toward bigness. It's and I said a corporate capitalist society. Yeah. And by the way, as we well know, the wealth and income gap since I wrote the book 50 plus years ago, exploded far more than it was in 1970. So why would anybody be surprised that Black-owned businesses, small businesses in general, but especially African-American-owned businesses, still basically are in the a capitalist economic system, are still basically economic outliers.
But that is true, right? But we also got to be attentive to the ways in which Black capital has changed. So I want to run some statistics by you. So in 1973, this is when Black Enterprise issued their first top 100 Black businesses, right? In that year, the top 100 Black businesses had $473 million in revenue. In 2018, the top 100 Black businesses had 30 billion in revenue. In 1973, the largest Black businesses 1 and 2 were Motown and the Johnson publications, right? And then, but it was filled up with auto dealerships, not parts manufacturers, but auto dealerships, and the cosmetic industry was there. Today, the leading sector of Black capital is technology and manufacturing, right? Worldwide technology is number one. And between technology and manufacturing, they compose 62% of the top 100 Black businesses. Now, granted, they still only control 3% of U.S. capital. During enslavement, we had 1% of U.S. capital. So very little has changed, as you say. But old capital was oriented toward the Black community. This new Black capitalist class, they're not oriented toward the Black community. They're oriented toward the totality of the consumer market here and abroad. And so I do think that that makes for a political difference in how they see their interests relative to us. And this rise, like, okay, so there's only 9 Black billionaires, right? But do you know what's really striking about the 9 Black billionaires, African American billionaires, I should say, or billionaires in the Black billionaires in the U.S. What's strange is that unlike white capital, 6 of the 9 are entertainers, right? You can't name an entertainer who is among the top billionaires of white folk, right? Mm-hmm. But we've got now 1.79 Black millionaires. And so my question is, we do have some capacity to begin to impact our situation, right? How do you account for, other than just saying they're capitalists, how do you account for the shift from a capitalist that to some degree had social commitments to Black folk to these Wild Wild West monopoly capitalists, Black capitalists we got today, who don't give a damn about the rest of us?
Yeah. Well, again, going back to the early 70s, when the barriers came down during that period, especially economic barriers, when African Americans were now for the first time at certain levels going up the scale, able to go into corporations, get managerial positions, able to open up different kinds of businesses, and also beginning to make more money, in the entertainment area and also the athletic area, sports and entertainment. That's always been the thing.
That's exactly what it is.
Well, and so what happened was, even within that kind of ghetto-wise area where you are, you had elasticity. Now, with the evolution, 80s, 90s, now tech is coming in, high-tech stuff, internationalism, globalization. So now you have some African Americans that were now poised to take advantage of that. But they're not looking, like you said, okay, we got a Johnson publication, clearly Black community. We got a Motown, clearly Black community. No, not anymore. That's now, right. Remember, times have changed. You got a global market. They're looking at that. You got a tech industry which dominates everything. That's where now the action is. So if you've got an African American that does have the means, some economic growth, capital, funding, they're going to move in those areas. They're not looking back at a Black community, because the Black community as we knew it then doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
That's gone. That's part of a bygone past where you had all the classes in one community together, working together, and kind of a cohesive unit. That's long gone.
That's gone. That's been gone. Yeah.
You think that it wouldn't reflect itself in the business world. Now, one other thing, you mentioned 1%, 3%. You mentioned Black billionaires, 9%.
No, not 9%. No, no, no,
No,
no.
no, no, I'm sorry.
Nine.
Nine.
Now,
Nine.
black millionaires are
If you were 9%, we would be having this conversation.
Yeah, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
All right.
Black
I missed
millionaires are 8.8% of all millionaires in the
Okay.
U.S.
Maybe that was a Freudian slip on that. Maybe that was a hope. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, you got 9. But
Yeah,
so
9.
that brings my point. How many billionaires do you have in the United States? You know, I just looked at that the other day.
Yeah.
You got hundreds of them. So 9,
you got
no.
thousands. Yeah.
You got thousands.
Yeah.
So, and by the way, almost how many millionaires do you have? You know, if you live in
5.2 million. There's 5.2
but wait a minute.
million
We have to be careful with that. Because if you live in a place like San Francisco or Los Angeles and you own a home, you're an instant millionaire. But I have to ask a question. If somebody came to you, and here's the thing we have to look at, and this is important to our discussion about blacks in economics. Can you write a check, all cash, for $1 million? No, I'm not talking about having to look at your property. I'm not talking about your mutual fund. I'm not talking about your pension. Can you write an all-cash check for $1 million? I would have to go to some of those black so-called billionaires and ask them. I want to look at your portfolio. I'd be very curious. You see where I'm going with this?
And I think you're correct that with a lot of those black millionaires, it's the property that they have, absolutely, and a lot of it that might be the earning, but once they pay the agent, once you know all of that gets taken out, like these the sports figures. Sure, their contract is for $2.2 million, but let's be clear, that's not what they're taking home.
That's great. Figure.
Yeah.
You know, so once again, we go back and make that contrast. What I said and what I wrote in 1970, if anything, it's gotten worse. We got more poor African Americans living in poverty, underserved, neglected, communities that are rotten. I live in LA, homeless capital of the world. You drive down, soon you drive down the city, you know, you think you're in Calcutta. And 90% of those that are out on the street, they're black men. 90% of them. And mine are not just old, young, all ages, families. Yeah. So even in 1970, I didn't see any of that.
Oh, no.
Guess what I see?
No, we didn't see that in the 40s.
And I didn't see it at no point in our history.
Yeah,
so
at no point.
You know, when you look at it, we're still on the margins, whether we're talking about business in the business world or beyond. So I think that is the thing that when you look at what's changed, and arguably there have been some change and some progress, I'm not denying that. But overall, in general, we're still positioned at the bottom of the economic barrel. That hasn't changed.
You know, look, that's why I coined the phrase that the new nadir, because you can't tell me that this moment we're in since 1980 isn't more reminiscent of what Rayford Logan was talking about at the end of the 19th century. So yeah. So look, I want to be respectful of your time. I had a big question, but I want to ask a smaller question, or actually make a suggestion. Brother, have you ever looked at your Wikipedia page?
You know what? I did for the first time a week ago. And what I decided to do was this, because it's very dated. What I decided to do was have one of my granddaughters. I'm going to have her. She's 15 years old. I don't think she's ever got anything other than the A in anything. Yeah. The young lady is a certifiable genius. So what I'm going to do is, and she's done a lot of research on our family history, and the whole genealogy thing, she's into that. What I'm going to do during the spring break, I'm going to give her an assignment. The assignment is to go back over your grandfather and pull everything you can, put it together, and update my Wikipedia page. That's going to be her assignment.
And she's got to take some things out, brother. You know that you are described as a conservative commentator.
I changed that. that.
You got rid of that one. Okay.
I got rid of that.
Okay, good. Because I'm like, huh?
No. I took that one word out and put progressive in there.
Good, good. Because it's crazy. But this is
Trust,
how they
trust,
slander folk.
trust me, my brother. We got it. We're on it.
Okay, good, good. Now, way back, the first time I met you was 1993. I'm sure you don't remember. I brought you to the University of Missouri, Columbia, Missouri.
I do remember.
You do?
I
Okay.
do.
The first time we met. And you said to me that you had changed. You didn't have the same politics and ideology as you had in the 70s, right? And so you were hinting at change. But as I sit here listening to you 2023, and I reread the Myth, seemed like you must have circled back. Something, brother.
I can tell you one thing. Remember, I said earlier, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah.
Guess what? That applies to me too. I am what I am. All right, my brother.
All right, it's been wonderful. Look, will you respond to a few questions, and then I'll let you go. Let me pull up a couple questions right quick, because the audience, they're here, they want to do some things. So let me find. Okay, one person says you already answered their questions, which is good. Okay, you know what? Okay, they want you to respond to this. What do you think about the Black experience in the U.S. being described as a caste system as opposed to class or racialized?
Well, very simple. I think it's both. I think it's class and race. And Dr. Du Bois and all the great scholars that delved into this question over time, they were always very clear. One feeds upon the other. The poorest of the poor are the blackest of the black, and the blackest of the black are the poorest of the poor. I'm just giving you a soundbite on that. That's the best way to put it.
But no, what they're interested in is this. Do you know the big book by Isabel Wilkerson that won all those awards that argued that the African American situation is a caste situation? So they're asking you to respond as to the caste question. And
Oh, caste.
Okay, I
yeah.
know you already said it's not caste, it's race and class.
Right.
What do you want to do? You want to say anything about this new phenomena of caste?
Yeah, it's kind of a concept I'd have to look at and think about, because I'm so oriented toward class and race in terms of our condition. Caste, that brings in a whole nother caste. That brings in a whole nother dimension. It's Super Bowl weekend. Let me punt on that one. Let me think about that. Let it germinate.
But you've already made the big point, which is that you see it as race and class. All right, I'm gonna find one more, and then I'm gonna let you go because I want to be respectful of your time. And nope. Okay, I'm finding no more questions. Just praise for what you had to say. So, my brother, I thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Wonderful, wonderful interview. Wonderful conversation.
Thank you very much. And by the way, what I'll do is send me the link on that. And what I'll do, I'll put it up on the Facebook page.
Will do.
All right. Thanks again.
Take care.
Take care. Have a good one.
Bye. Okay. Okay. All right. I'm just gonna end the stream.